My name is Ramiro, and I've spent my entire life believing that sacrifice and love were enough to guarantee gratitude. As a boy, I learned that a man's worth was measured by the sweat on his brow, the steadfastness of his hands, and his word kept. And that's how I lived, working day and night tirelessly to give my children a better life than mine. While others rested on holidays, I was up. While many slept, I carried boxes, drove trucks, fixed engines, planted, harvested, did whatever it took. Every drop of sweat, every backache, every sleepless night, everything had a purpose. To see my children grow up without going hungry, without feeling the burden I felt when I was young. It was like this for decades. I bought my first house with double the effort, paid for schools with extra hours, sacrificed my health so they would never have to hear the word no. When my wife passed away, I swore before her coffin that I would not let them want for anything, and I kept it. I fought like two men to be a father and a mother, even when my body could no longer take it. And for a long time, I thought I was doing the right thing. I saw my children studying, working, and starting a family. Pride warmed my heart. I told myself, it was worth it, Ramiro. All the effort was worth it. But I was wrong. Because one day, when my strength began to fail, when I needed support, affection, and care, what I received from them was not gratitude. It was contempt. The same son I taught, the same daughter I helped raise her children looked at me and turned their backs. Without guilt, without remorse, as if I were just a bothersome shadow of the past. And that day, sitting alone in my old chair, I understood the cruelty of ingratitude. It doesn't shout, it doesn't explain, it just closes the door and walks away. This is my story. The story of a grandfather who gave everything he had, and who in the end had to learn that a man's greatest value lies not in his children's gratitude, but in something much greater. When I think of the word sacrifice, I don't think about books or beautiful phrases. I think about calluses, on my hands, my feet, even my soul. I think about the smell of burnt oil clinging to my clothes, the sweat dripping down before the sun had even risen. I think about the countless times I worked 2 shifts in a row, without sleeping, just to pay my son's tuition. Years went by like this. I never knew a vacation. I never knew what it was like to relax for a whole weekend. When my colleagues went fishing, I went unload trucks. When neighbors traveled, I took advantage of it to work overtime. All the money that came in went into food, clothes, books, medicine. Nothing was for me. It was for them. Always for them. When my wife died, I swore I would double my strength. And that's what I did. Widowed for over 20 years, I lived as if I were 2 men. I never allowed myself to weaken. I remember coming home late at night, so tired I could barely take off my boots, but I still made dinner for my children. Sometimes I fell asleep sitting at the table, my head on the plate, but happy that they were fed. They grew up, studied, and graduated. I proudly watched each diploma in their hands. Each achievement was a victory for me. I thought it was worth it, it was all worth it. But time takes its toll. The body ages, strength diminishes, and there comes a day when those who have always given must now receive. I never asked for much. I didn't ask for luxury, I didn't ask for money, I just wanted presence, affection, respect. But when I reached out my weary hands, what I found was emptiness. They were no longer there. At first, I didn't realize the distance. I thought it was just the hustle and bustle of life. The phone calls that were decreasing, the visits that were becoming fewer, always with excuses. Too much work. The kids are sick. I can't make it this week, Dad. Maybe next Sunday? I believed, because I wanted to believe. But little by little, I began to understand that it wasn't a lack of time. It was a lack of will. Their absence began to weigh heavily on me in a way that no amount of silence in an empty house can hide. Birthdays passed without a party, Christmases without a full table. All that remained was the rocking chair, the clock on the wall, and me, staring at the closed doors. One day I needed help getting to the doctor. My legs weren't working as they used to, and my breathing was shallow. I called my son. He answered, but he responded quickly, almost impatiently. Dad, I can't make it now. I have a meeting. See if the neighbor can take you. And he hung up. I held the phone in my hand for minutes, listening to the beep of silence. The neighbor took me, but something inside me broke. It wasn't about the appointment. It was about realizing that, to him, I was no longer a priority. My daughter, whom I helped raise, also drifted away. I'd call and almost always go to voicemail. When I answered, I'd respond with short sentences like someone who speaks only out of obligation. One day I even heard, "Father, you have to understand. I have my life now." That phrase echoed like a sentence. I have my life now. As if I were part of a past that no longer deserved space. It was then that I realized, after a lifetime of sacrifice, I was alone. The nights grew longer and longer. The house that once echoed with laughter and running footsteps now had only the sound of creaking wood and the wind rattling the windows. I sat in the armchair looking at the old photos hanging on the wall and wondering where those smiling children who once called me their hero had gone. One of those nights, I pulled out an old memory box from a drawer. Inside were school letters, drawings my children had made when they were little, Father's Day notes written in crooked handwriting. I read one of them aloud. "Daddy, you are the best in the world. I will never leave you alone." The yellowed paper seemed to mock me. That boy who wrote had become the man who now avoided my calls. The weight of loneliness grew. There were no more spontaneous visits, no more children's voices running through the yard. Neighbors would sometimes greet me, but then quickly go about their daily lives. And I, having spent my entire life surrounded by people, discovered silence as the cruelest of enemies. The worst part was the feeling of uselessness. My tired body no longer allowed me to do what I once did with ease. I swept the yard one morning and had to stop 3 times to rest. As I stared at the ground, almost exhausted, I remembered the words my daughter had said to me, "I have my life now." It seemed that to them, mine no longer mattered. At that moment, for the first time, I wondered if it had been worth it. All the sweat, all the sleepless nights, all the sacrifices. Did they even remember? Did it really matter? And the silence of the house answered for them. The weeks dragged by, all the same. I woke up early out of habit even though I had nowhere to go. I made too much coffee for one person, still hoping deep down that someone would show up unexpectedly to share it with me. But no one came. The coffee would go cold on the table and I drank it alone in silence. I began to notice that even the neighbors, when they passed by, avoided calling me. Perhaps they didn't want to get involved. Perhaps they'd heard my children say that the old man complains too much, or that he doesn't adapt to today's world. This was the new version of me they were spreading. Not the man of sacrifice, but the uncomfortable weight of someone who only knew how to demand. One afternoon, I had to go to the bank to resolve a problem. I stood for over an hour, waiting for service, and my legs gave out. I sat on the sidewalk, panting, staring at the ground. No one offered to help. I picked up the phone and called my daughter. She answered coldly, "Dad, I can't right now. I'm at the mall with the kids. Try to get a taxi." He hung up before I could answer. There, sitting on the sidewalk, I watched my life flash before my eyes. I thought about the double shifts, the birthdays I'd missed to pay bills, the toys I'd made with my own hands because I couldn't afford them. All of this so my children would never have to feel what I felt. And now, as time demanded a little care from me, they simply left me there, as if I were nobody. It was on that day that I felt the most cruel pain. It wasn't just loneliness. It was the feeling of having been forgotten in life. That night, I arrived home exhausted, not from the weight of my legs, but from the weight of my soul. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, my heart sinking. I, Ramiro, who had faced hunger, cold, illness, and so many struggles to support my children, was now defeated by something I could not fight: their indifference. I remembered every promise I made to myself when I was young. I promised my children would never want, and I kept it. I promised I would always be there for them, and I was. I promised I would endure any pain to see them smile, and I did. But I never imagined the price of that would be being cast aside, forgotten like an object no longer useful. The deepest wound was not loneliness, but the feeling that everything had been in vain. I asked myself, what good is a lifetime of sacrifice if in the end those you fought for are the first to turn their backs? I stood up, walked to the mirror, and stared at my own aging face. Deep wrinkles, tired eyes, hunched shoulders. I touched the glass and thought, is that what they see? Just a tired old man who has nothing left to offer. It was at that moment that I felt an emptiness greater than any physical pain. It wasn't just their absence, it was the absence of purpose. For the first time, I feared that my final years would be marked not by the dignity of a life of struggle, but by the abandonment of those who should have been with me until the end. And with that pain, I fell asleep in silence. After that bitter night, something began to change inside me. The emptiness was great, but it wasn't just pain. There was also a restlessness that told me I couldn't end my days like this, forgotten and erased. I spent days reflecting, sitting on the porch, gazing at the horizon as if searching for answers in the sky. With each sunrise, I wondered if my story was truly doomed to end in silence. It was during this time that I began to revisit my past. I took out boxes I hadn't opened in years, pay stubs, old photos, letters from when my wife was still alive, notes from my children when they were young. Each piece of paper was like a testament to the life I'd led. Here was concrete proof that I hadn't lived in vain, that my sacrifice hadn't been a figment of my weary memory. As I sorted through these documents, I realized something important. My children had forgotten not only me, but the history that brought us here. The comfortable life they now led had been built on sleepless nights, calloused hands, and dreams I'd cast aside. Perhaps part of their ingratitude stemmed from forgetting, and I decided, if they'd erased their memory, I would rekindle it. I started writing everything down in a black-covered notebook I'd found lost in a drawer. I wrote down dates, facts, and concrete sacrifices. For example, 1993, I worked 72 hours straight to pay for Joan's surgery. Or 1997, I sold my watch to buy Anna's school supplies. Each note was like regaining a piece of dignity. But it wasn't just about collecting memories. I needed to understand why, after all this, they had turned their backs on me. And to do that, I began to observe more, to listen to the little comments that slipped out when they called me in a hurry, to put the pieces together. It wasn't just indifference. There was something deeper, a mixture of shame, selfishness, and even other people's influence. In that process of silent investigation, I realized one thing clearly. The cruelest lie was not the one others told about me, but the one they began to believe, that I was no longer good for anything. That's when I decided I wouldn't allow this lie to be the last chapter of my life. The following days were different. I no longer simply waited for phone calls that never came or visitors that never arrived. Now I had a purpose, to gather every piece of my story and transform it into living proof of who I truly was. I began revisiting places that had been part of my journey. I returned to the old workshop where I'd worked for almost 20 years. The building was closed, abandoned, but there were still neighbors who remembered me. One of them, an elderly gentleman named Ernesto, greeted me with a smile. "Ramiro, are you still alive? I remember you coming in and out of here every day, dawn and dusk. You worked like no one else." Those words warmed me. I took a piece of that memory with me, because I realized that my value wasn't just stored in papers but also in the memories of the people who witnessed my life. I also visited Julian, a former trucking colleague. We sat on his porch and spent hours talking about the past. He reminded me of things even I had forgotten. The times I shared my lunch with other drivers, the shifts I covered when someone was sick, the times I came home only to leave again because another shift awaited me. "Ramiro, you were always stronger than all of us," he said seriously. "But what struck me most wasn't your strength, it was your dedication. You gave everything for your children." I left there with tears in my eyes. Meanwhile, at home, I continued filling my black notebook. Every memory, every testimony, every piece of evidence was carefully recorded. And the more I wrote, the more I understood that my confrontation wouldn't be with shouting, but with the truth. I needed to show my family who I really was, and everything I'd done for them, because they had erased that memory, and in its place allowed coldness and indifference to grow. I also began to notice the details of the past few years. I recalled hurried phrases like when my daughter complained about how hard it was to take care of me, or when my son said that one day I would have to get used to living alone. These words, which I had previously tried to forget, now became pieces of a puzzle that revealed a cruel truth. They had already decided to cast me aside, as if I were an old book stored on a shelf, useless. But inside me, something burned. It wasn't just pain. It was wounded dignity, begging for a voice. And I decided, at the next family gathering, I wouldn't be silent anymore. I would speak out, not to beg for affection, but to remind everyone who Ramiro was and what it took to get here. It was the beginning of a plan. When I returned from Julian's house that night, I sat at the table with the black notebook in front of me, my heart racing. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was an inventory of an entire life. Each written line carried weight. Each recorded memory was like lifting bricks from a house they were trying to demolish. I began organizing my memories in order. My children's childhood, their youth, moments of crisis, achievements that only happened because I was there laying the foundations. I also separated the documents I still had, school pay stubs, proof of paid-off loans, even photographs of me, covered in grease but smiling beside them. This wasn't vanity. It was justice. I also decided to write letters, one to my son, one to my daughter. Not accusatory letters, but letters of truth. In them, I explained what each sacrifice had meant, telling stories they might no longer remember. I wrote, "Son, you only got to wear that white coat on graduation day because I was pulling all-nighters behind the wheel of a truck, and I would do it all over again, but I can't accept them dismissing my life as if it had no value." Tears fell onto the paper, blurring some of the words, but I left it that way. The tear marks were proof of my sincerity. Over the next few days, I began talking to myself in front of the mirror. I rehearsed what I would say when I got the chance. At first, my voice faltered. My eyes welled up, but by repeating, I gained confidence. I didn't want to sound like a bitter old man, but like someone who had a right to be heard. At the same time, I felt the weight of doubt. What if they laugh at me? What if they call me dramatic? What if, in the end, all this changes nothing? These questions echoed in my chest, but I soon remembered Ernesto and Julian's words, the neighbors' looks, the vivid memories in the notebook. I wasn't crazy, nor was I a burden. I had lived for them, and now I needed to live for myself, for my name, for my honor. On the last page I wrote that week, I wrote, "I don't want you to love me out of pity. I want you to respect the man I still am." With that sentence, I closed the notebook, and I knew my confrontation was getting closer. The days leading up to my final decision were the most intense I've experienced in many years. I woke up early, as always, but not to go to work, but to work on myself. I sat on the porch, my black notebook on my lap, and reread each page. It was like revisiting an entire film of my life. I saw the young man carrying bags of cement, the man driving trucks on dark roads, the father who forgoed buying new clothes to ensure his children had school supplies. Everything was there, recorded, not as regret, but as testimony. Over the course of those silent mornings, something began to shift inside me. The pain of rejection was still there, but it was being replaced by a flame of dignity. Every memory I jotted down was like a reminder. Ramiro, you did not live in vain. They may have forgotten, but you know who you are. It was during this period that I also decided to prepare concrete evidence. I sorted through old documents, employment contracts, loan receipts, letters from the school thanking me for my efforts to keep my children enrolled even during the most difficult times. I gathered photographs of me in the background, almost always dirty and tired, but smiling because I saw my children receiving something I never had. Each piece of paper went into a blue folder, which I began to carry with me like a shield. I spoke again with people from my past. The baker still remembered the times I'd pass by in the early hours of the morning on my way to work and buy bread on credit just so my children wouldn't go without breakfast. Donna Mercedes, my old neighbor, remembered the day she saw me come home with bleeding hands because I'd worked late and also fixed the fence to keep the children out of danger. All these testimonies reinforced the truth I already knew, but which I needed to share. At the same time, I prepared my heart. I began writing prayers in my notebook, even though I didn't quite know how to pray. I wrote phrases like, "God, don't let me die with this lump stuck in my throat," or "Lord, give me courage to speak without hatred, but with firmness." They were simple words, but they were what I had. When I finally learned there would be a family gathering, one of my grandchildren's birthdays, I knew that this would be the moment. There would be no other. I closed the blue folder, placed the black notebook on top, and said out loud, looking in the mirror. At the next meeting, they will hear who Ramiro is. The birthday week seemed to drag on, but each day served as a silent rehearsal for what was to come. I knew it wouldn't be easy to face them all at once, to look into my children's eyes and say the words that burned in my heart. But I also knew that if I didn't do it now, I might never have the opportunity again. And then I would die silently, my dignity stifled. The day before the party, I organized everything as if it were a mission. I spread the documents on the table, yellowed receipts, old letters, photographs that recorded sacrifices no one remembered. I took out the black notebook and reviewed every line. There was not only my story, but my defense. It wasn't against a court that I was preparing, but against oblivion and against ingratitude. I also carefully folded 2 letters I'd written, one for each child. I didn't know if I'd have the courage to read them aloud, but I wanted them to somehow hear every word. There were no accusations in the letters. There was only the naked truth, how much I'd given, how much I'd endured, and how none of it deserved to end in abandonment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the dark house, looking at every corner. I touched the walls I'd built with my own hands, ran my fingers over the furniture I'd bought on installments, and remembered the nights I'd held my children in my arms until they fell asleep. Every detail reminded me why I needed to speak out. It wasn't out of pride. It was out of justice. The next morning, I put on my best shirt, the one I saved for special occasions. I ironed my hair, even though it was thin and gray, and put on the shoes I rarely wore. It wasn't vanity. It was self-respect. I put on my antique wristwatch, a gift from my wife for one of our wedding anniversaries, and felt as if she were with me, walking beside me. Before leaving, I sat on the porch and, for the first time in many years, spoke out loud to God. Lord, I don't know what will happen today. Perhaps they will mock me, perhaps they will be silent again. But give me courage to speak without anger, and strength not to break down. May my words be remembered, not for the weight of pain, but for the truth they carry. I stood up, clutched the blue folder tightly, and walked toward the gate. My heart was pounding, but I was certain. I was ready. The confrontation was no longer just inevitable. It was necessary. The gate to my son's house creaked as I pushed it open. The yard was full of voices, laughter, and the smell of roasting meat. Children ran, relatives chatted, everything seemed like an ordinary party, except to me. I walked slowly, clutching the blue briefcase to my chest like a shield. Each step echoed the memory of years I'd come here with gifts, shopping bags, and the invisible sacrifices that supported those same walls. Some greeted me with quick waves, but their looks betrayed it. To them, I was just the quiet old man who always sits in the corner. I sat alone in a chair tucked into the shade, and from there I watched. Clara, my son's wife, organized the table like absolute mistress of the space. My son, his shoulders always slumped, obeyed her every command. My daughter was off to one side, surrounded by cousins, but didn't even glance at me. The party continued, and I said nothing. I waited. My heart was racing with each passing minute, but there was a distinct calm within me. It wasn't an absence of fear. It was the certainty that this was the moment I had been preparing for. When everyone was called to sing happy birthday and the family gathered around the table, I took a deep breath. Before the candles were lit, I stood up. The conversations gradually died down, and everyone's eyes turned to me. I held the blue folder tightly and said in a clear, unshakable voice, "Before you cut this cake, I have something to say." Silence fell heavily, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the surrounding trees. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, others frowned, and Clara crossed her arms with a sneer, already preparing to laugh. I slowly opened the folder, took out the black notebook, and placed it on the table. I looked around and continued. I spent my entire life sacrificing every day, every night, so that you could have what I never had. I gave you education, food, shelter, and a future. But when I needed you, I turned my back on each of you. Today, I will not remain silent. Today, you will hear who Ramiro is. The room hung in the air. It was the beginning of the confrontation. The silence that fell was so dense it seemed even the wind in the yard had stopped to listen. I could see the uncomfortable looks, the tense expressions. Some looked away, others stared at me in astonishment as if they couldn't believe I, the always quiet old man, would have the courage to stand up there, in the middle of the party. I took a deep breath and continued, my voice firm but full of emotion. Remember 1993 when João got sick and needed urgent surgery? Everyone was desperate, not knowing where to get the money. It was I who worked 3 days straight without sleep to pay that bill. I opened the black notebook and showed a yellowed receipt. Here it is. I showed another paper. In 1997, when Anna almost lost her school enrollment because we couldn't afford it anymore, I sold my watch, the only possession that still had value. She studied, graduated, and became the professional she is today. It's written here, with the date, with the value. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear, from indignation. I'm not saying this to demand anything, I'm saying this because when you look at me today, you act as if I'm just a useless old man, someone who only gets in the way. But I want you to know, if you walk safely today, it's because someone paved the way with blood, sweat, and tears. That someone was me. I looked directly at my children. João lowered his eyes, not daring to look at me. Anna bit her lip as if about to respond, but remained silent. Clara, trying to lighten the mood, gave a mocking laugh and said out loud, "Here he comes with his hero stories, always wanting to make himself bigger." I felt my blood boil, but I didn't lose control. I lightly slapped my palm on the notebook and said, "These aren't stories, Clara, they're facts, evidence. And if anyone here doubts it, they should have the courage to say, looking me in the eye, that I wasn't there when they needed me most." Nobody said anything. I knew it. The wall of silence and contempt was beginning to crack. With each passing second, the silence felt heavier. I saw on their faces not only discomfort, but also memories stirring, as if the words I brought were opening doors they'd all rather keep closed. I pulled a photo from the folder. It was faded, but it showed Anna, still a child, standing with a new backpack on her back. I held it up for everyone to see. "That backpack," I said firmly, "didn't just fall from the sky. It was bought the same month I stopped paying the electricity bill, and we spent an entire week by candlelight. Remember that?" Well, I do. I made it so my daughter could walk with her head held high at school. I put the photo on the table and took another one. João was a teenager with the bike he wanted so much. This bike, I bought it with the money I earned after fixing 10 cars in a week, working Sunday to Sunday. While everyone else was resting, I had my hands covered in grease. I did it because I wanted to see my son happy. My eyes filled with tears, but I continued. And today, after all this, what did I get in return? Closed doors, ignored phone calls, the cruel phrase, "I have my own life now," as if mine no longer mattered. At that moment, I saw some relatives nearby begin to murmur. Dona Mercedes, the neighbor who was present, nodded, confirming my every word. I knew I wasn't alone. João finally looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. Anna crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself from the memories I just shared. But Clara remained impassive with that air of disdain she always carried. I looked straight at her and said, "You can laugh, Clara. You can pretend my words are just old wives' tales. But what I've lived through is here, etched in every scar on my body, in every callus on my hands. Nothing you say can erase that." I saw his smile fade. Tensions were running high. The confrontation wasn't over yet, but the truth could no longer be hidden. The table seemed frozen. The smell of freshly cut cake no longer mattered. The noise of the children outside seemed distant. Everyone was gripped by the weight of my words. I took a deep breath, looked at my children and said, "João, Anna, look at me." My voice came out firm, even with the lump in my throat. "Do you really believe I deserve the abandonment I've experienced? That all my worth is being an old nuisance?" João lowered his head, fidgeting with his hands nervously. Anna looked away, staring at the floor. I tapped the black notebook lightly, so the sound echoed in the silence, and continued. "You know me. You know about every sleepless night. You know about the body that collapsed from exhaustion and still got up to work. You know I didn't live for myself. I lived for you. So tell me now, in front of everyone, at what point did I stop being worthy of your respect?" No one answered. Their silence was more painful than any harsh words they could have said. I saw tears begin to stream down João's face, but he still didn't speak. Anna bit her lip as if every memory I brought back was an arrow piercing her defenses. You turned your backs on me without remorse, I continued, my voice breaking. But I need you to answer me here, in front of this family. Is this what I deserve? After everything I've done, is this who I am to you? The tension was so great that even Clara, always ready to intervene, remained silent. Her usual arrogance had turned into discomfort. It was then that John, with a trembling voice, finally spoke. Father, I never said I believed you were no longer useful, but I kept quiet. I hid behind silence because it was easier. I failed. Tears streamed down my face. Anna still resisted, but her watery eyes betrayed the battle raging within her. I knew it. The wall of indifference was beginning to crumble. John's words echoed in the yard like thunder. I failed. It was the first time my son had admitted in front of everyone that his silence was also a betrayal. The confession drew murmurs from the gathered family, looks of surprise, and even discreet tears from some relatives. I stood up, even though my legs were tired, and said, Son, it wasn't the silence that killed me, it was the indifference. Every time I needed you and heard only excuses, I felt like a part of me was being ripped away. But today, hearing you admit it, it's already an answer I've waited for years. Anna, who had remained silent until then, stood up abruptly. Her eyes were watery, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath and spoke loudly, almost like a cry of pain. I made a mistake too, Dad. I said I had my own life now, but deep down I was afraid. Afraid to admit I had to take care of you like you took care of me. Afraid to see in your tired face how much time has passed. I turned my back on you, because it was easier to pretend I didn't see you. Shock gripped the table. Some relatives covered their mouths, others wept silently. Clara tried to interrupt, but Anna gently pushed her away and continued. You don't deserve what we did. No father deserves this. Tears streamed uncontrollably down my face. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The black notebook was still open on the table, but it wasn't the papers that spoke anymore. It was their voices, broken, remorseful, begging for forgiveness. You abandoned me, I whispered, sobbing. But today, for the first time, I see that there is still hope. There was a moment of absolute silence, as if even time had stopped. I knew this was the climax of the confrontation. The truth had been told, the mask of indifference had fallen. But at the same time, I realized something even greater. Even though the pain had been exposed, my heart was still wounded. And there, in that moment of tears and confessions, I understood that justice would not be enough. I needed something more, healing. The true outcome would not come just from their recognition, but from something only God could do. After that night of confrontation, I returned home with the blue folder and black notebook under my arm. I should have been at peace. After all, my children had admitted to everyone their abandonment, their silence, their ingratitude. For the first time, João and Anna had dropped the masks they wore, and the truth had triumphed over the lies. But when I closed the door and was alone, I realized that there was still a void inside me. Yes, they had asked for forgiveness. Yes, everyone had heard. But the wounds didn't disappear overnight. My heart still throbbed with pain, as if the cruel words I'd heard over the years were still etched into the walls of my soul. I sat in the armchair, staring at the open notebook. The evidence, the memories, the documents, all of it revealed the man I had been. But who was I now? A tired old man, trying to prove his worth, and a question kept gnawing at my mind. Is it enough to hear their forgiveness for my heart to be healed? The answer I knew was no. So, for the first time in years, I did something I hadn't done since my wife left. I knelt beside the bed and began to speak to God. It wasn't a pretty, memorized prayer. It was a sobbed outburst. Lord, I can't take it anymore. I fought, I worked, I sacrificed, and still I was abandoned. Today they recognized me, but inside me there are still wounds. Heal me, Father. Show me that I still have a purpose, that my life is not over. Tears fell, soaking the ground. And it was there, in that silence of the night, that something different happened. I saw no lights, heard no audible voices, but I felt a real presence. It was as if a gentle hand rested on my weary shoulder, and a still voice spoke deep within my soul. Ramiro, I never abandoned you. My chest burst into tears, But it wasn't from pain anymore. It was a cry of relief, of liberation. For the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't alone. That morning, still on my knees, the tears wouldn't stop falling. But they were different tears, not tears of despair like so many times before. It was as if each drop washed away a piece of the bitterness I'd carried in my chest for years. I no longer had the strength to fight with my own arms, and I realized that this was exactly what God wanted of me, for me to stop fighting alone. As I wept, I remembered the words I had heard my wife say so many times when she was still alive. Ramiro, the love that comes from God is the only one that never fails. And in that moment, I felt it like never before. It wasn't a distant thought, it was a living presence filling every corner of my soul. The Holy Spirit enveloped me like an invisible cloak, and the weight that had been crushing me seemed to dissolve. For the first time in years, I didn't think about revenge. I didn't think about demanding anything or rubbing the evidence in anyone's face. I thought only about forgiveness. Not human, conditional forgiveness, but the forgiveness Jesus offered on the cross. A forgiveness that doesn't ask if the other person deserves it, but simply chooses to love. I stood up slowly, wiped my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. The tired man was still there. Wrinkles, white hair, hunched shoulders. But his eyes were different. I no longer saw just pain, but hope. I wasn't just the forgotten father, the abandoned grandfather. I was a beloved child of God, and no one could take that away from me. At that moment, I understood that the greatest victory of my life had not been exposing my children to my family, but finding in Christ the strength to free my heart from resentment. And I decided I would no longer carry the hurt. I would forgive them. And more than that, I would speak of the forgiveness that found me that night. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The birdsong sounded different, more vivid, as if nature itself was celebrating what had happened to me that morning. I sat on the porch, my eyes still red from crying, but there was a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of resentment had been lifted. I took the black notebook and on the last page wrote with a steady hand, "Today, I am not just the man who sacrificed his entire life for his children. I am the man who found in Christ the reason to forgive." I decided I wouldn't wait for another confrontation. I would go to my children myself, but this time not to accuse them, but to free them from the burden they also carried. Because I realized that, although they had hurt me, they too were trapped by guilt. The following Sunday, I walked over to John's house. He opened the door in surprise, perhaps expecting a hard look or bitter words, but I just smiled and said, "Son, I didn't come to ask for anything. I came to tell you that you are already forgiven." He stood still, his eyes brimming with tears. And when he hugged me, I could feel his shoulders shaking, as if finally letting go of a burden that had been weighing him down for years. That same afternoon, I went to Anna. She was in the backyard working on the plants and looked at me with alarm. Before she could say anything, I said, "Daughter, you don't need to justify yourself anymore. What happened is in the past. I forgive you." She tried to speak, but tears prevented her from doing so. He came to me and hugged me, repeating several times, "Father, forgive me. Forgive me." There I realized that forgiveness not only freed me, but freed them as well. And deep in my heart I knew this was the true victory God wanted to give me. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. News of the reconciliation spread through the family. Those who had previously looked away when they saw me began to approach, shyly, as if trying to understand what had happened. I didn't need to say much. Forgiveness spoke for itself. That following Sunday we gathered again, but not for a regular party. My children, on their own initiative, invited the family over for lunch. When I arrived, I was greeted unexpectedly. Joam opened the door with a genuine smile, and Anna ran to hug me before I even entered. There was no falseness in the gestures. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't a burden, but a part of them. We all sat down at the table. The conversations, which had previously been marked by tension and awkward silences, now flowed smoothly. At one point, João asked to speak. "I want to say before everyone that we failed our father. He gave us everything, and we repaid him with abandonment. But God, in his mercy, used this man to teach us what forgiveness is." Tears streamed down several faces. Anna added, There is no greater shame for a child than seeing their own father having to prove his worth. But thank God he turned our shame into an opportunity for change. As she spoke, Clara, who had until then maintained her cool and proud demeanor, lowered her eyes. She remained silent for a few seconds, until she finally murmured, "I also need to apologize. For years I treated you with contempt as if your life no longer had value. But it was you, Ramiro, who showed me what dignity is." I looked at her and smiled. It wasn't a smile of superiority, but of relief. "Clara, forgiveness is not mine. It's God's. I simply chose to give it, just as I received it." The atmosphere changed completely. The yard, once a scene of contempt and coldness, was now filled with tears of regret and sincere hugs. My grandchildren surrounded me, and one of them asked softly, "Grandpa, how did you manage to forgive after everything?" I hugged him tightly and replied, "Because Jesus forgave me first, my son. And whoever is reached by his forgiveness can no longer live holding a grudge." That day was marked not as a simple reunion, but as a new beginning. When I returned home that night, after that reconciliation lunch, I sat in the old armchair on the porch, the same place where months before I had wept in silence, feeling forgotten in life. Only now the silence no longer hurt. It was a silence filled with peace. I picked up the black notebook and opened it to the last page. In bold letters I wrote, "It wasn't confrontation that saved my story. It was Christ's forgiveness." At that moment, I understood that everything I had experienced, the sleepless nights, the endless shifts, the closed doors, the cruel abandonment, was part of a path that would lead me to this point. Understanding that no human sacrifice is capable of transforming hearts like God's love, the victory was not proving who I was. The victory was recognizing who He is. I could have spent the rest of my days wallowing in grief, stewing in every word that hurt me. But when I knelt and asked Jesus to heal my heart, He did infinitely more. He not only gave me peace, but used my pain to reach my family. Today, my children look to me not only as their hardworking father, but as a living witness that forgiveness is stronger than any betrayal. Clara, once cold and distant, now treats me with respect. My grandchildren will grow up knowing that their grandfather wasn't defeated by resentment, but transformed by love. And I, who one day thought I had lost everything, discovered that I still had the essential, the Lord, who never left me. As I closed the notebook, I looked up at the starry sky and murmured, "Thank you, Jesus." Because when everyone turned their backs on me, you embraced me. This was the true turning point. Not revenge, not exposure, but the restoration that only Christ can bring. And so my story, which seemed destined to end in solitude, was rewritten by the hand of God.